I wasn't even supposed to be in London that week. My original itinerary had me somewhere in Edinburgh, nursing a cold cup of tea and arguing with a hostile receptionist about whether my booking was real or not. But the train got canceled, something about signal failures north of York, and so I ended up rerouted, luggage and all, back to Paddington, back into the underground, and back into the city. I'd already said goodbye to twice that trip. I got out at St. James's Park Station around 10:30 in the morning. The sky was doing that thing it does in London sometimes. Not quite threatening, not quite safe. The kind of gray that doesn't commit. You look up and you think, well, it probably won't rain. And then you keep thinking that on a loop every 4 minutes because it genuinely looks like it might not. The clouds were sitting low and thick, stacked against each other like old books no one wanted to move. It was a Thursday. I remember that specifically because I'd eaten the same cheese sandwich from Pret 2 Thursdays in a row, and I was already dreading the idea of a third one. Small, useless detail. But that's what Thursdays in London feel like to me now, soggy cheese and indecisive weather. I've been to Buckingham Palace before, obviously. You go the first time because you feel like you're supposed to. You stand there, you take the photo with the gates in the background, you wait to feel something profound, and mostly you just feel cold and slightly cheated. But this time I wasn't going for the postcard moment. I was going because it was on the way to the gallery I actually wanted to see, and because walking through St. James's Park when the leaves are doing what London leaves do in that particular light is one of those free things that still manages to feel like it costs you something good. The park was quieter than usual. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. Normally, even on off-season weekday mornings, there's a density to the foot traffic around that part of the city. Tourists with guidebooks, office workers cutting through with earbuds in, couples not really talking to each other, but existing in each other's orbit, joggers with that specific London jogger expression, which is somewhere between determination and low-grade misery. That morning, the paths were almost empty. A woman walked a very small dog that seemed deeply unhappy about the wind. A man in a yellow jacket sat on a bench eating something wrapped in foil, not looking at anything. 2 teenagers near the bridge were taking photos of the pelicans, and the pelicans were tolerating it with their usual air of exhausted superiority. I walked through slowly. The air had that pre-rain smell, not yet wet, but like something was getting ready to become wet. Like the atmosphere was holding its breath. There's a specific kind of pressure in that moment, right before weather turns. It sits behind your ears. It makes you check your pockets for things you're not sure you brought. I crossed the park and came out on the mall. The palace came into view the way it always does, all at once, flat, and enormous, and slightly less impressive than you expect every time, and yet you still stop, still look. There's something about the scale of it that your brain just keeps refusing to fully accept. There were maybe 40, 50 people gathered near the gates. Not the summer numbers, not the wall of bodies you get in July when every second person is holding up an iPad and someone's child is definitely going to get separated from their family and the whole thing turns vaguely chaotic. This was the smaller, quieter crowd. October visitors. The ones who did their research, wore the right shoes, had actually looked up the changing of the guard schedule before arriving. I stayed near the back of the small crowd and watched. And that's when I first saw him. He was stationed at the left sentry box, the one that faces slightly toward Constitution Hill, angled so that if you're standing where I was standing, you get almost his full profile. Tall, the kind of tall that reads differently in a bearskin hat and a scarlet tunic than it would on an ordinary street. The uniform always does something strange to scale. It makes the person inside it look simultaneously more and less human. He was standing the way they stand, which sounds obvious to say, but if you've ever actually watched one of them for more than a few seconds, not the glance and move on that most people do, but actually stood there and looked, you start to notice what that posture costs. The stillness is not passive. It's the opposite of passive. It's something being held with deliberate, continuous effort. Every muscle doing exactly the right amount of work, and not one fiber more. Arms at the side, chin at the exact angle. Rifle positioned against the shoulder in a way that looks like geometry. I don't know his name. I didn't know it then. I still don't. But I'm going to call him something just for the sake of telling this properly, because referring to him as the guard for 6,000 words feels like its own kind of failure. So let's call him what the woman beside me eventually called him, almost to herself, when the rain started and none of us quite moved. She called him remarkable. His name for this story is Dane. Not because that's what it was. I genuinely don't know what it was. But there was something about his bearing, some quality of absolute locked-in presence that felt Nordic to me. Old, like a word in a language you've never spoken, but somehow understand the weight of. Dane. He'd been there when I arrived. He'd be there long after most of the people around me decided the sky was no longer worth gambling on. The first sign came around 11:15. The wind shifted, not dramatically, not in the way that makes people stop walking and look up, just a degree or two in direction, just enough to carry the temperature from tolerable to something else. The small dog near the bench started pulling toward its owner. The teenagers put their phones away, not all the way, but halfway into pockets, which is the universal gesture for okay, let's maybe reassess. Someone near me said, it's going to rain. And someone else said, it'll pass. And both of them were wrong in their own particular way. I checked my phone. No signal worth trusting. The weather app was doing that thing where it tells you the current weather with great confidence, but the forecast shifts every time you refresh. It said light drizzle. It said this with the conviction of someone who had never been outside. I decided to stay a little longer. I'm not sure why. I could say it was curiosity. I could say it was the specific quality of the light, the way the clouds were now doing something more architectural, building upward in ways that made the flat facade of the palace look almost modest by comparison. But honestly, I think it was him. Dane hadn't moved, not in the way that everything else was moving. The flag above the palace was starting to argue with the wind. The leaves on the nearby trees were making their racket. The tourists around me were shifting, adjusting, doing the small human recalibration that weather prompts. Bags were repositioned. Collars were turned up. People were glancing skyward with that London expression that says, I know, I should have brought a proper jacket, but here we are. He didn't glance at anything. His eyes were forward, not in a locked, robotic way, not like a machine set to a fixed point. There was something alive in that gaze, something that was absolutely present in the moment while also being completely removed from it, like he was inside the storm and also somewhere else entirely. I pulled my jacket tighter and stayed. The first rain came at 11:43. I know because I checked my phone at that exact moment. Not because I was tracking the time, but because someone nearby had their phone go off, a loud ringtone, something inappropriately cheerful for the mood, and the sound made me reflexively look at my own screen. 11:43. 3% battery warning. Great. The rain was light at first, the kind that makes you think you can wait out. Soft and sideways. Not enough to soak you in the first 30 seconds, but definitely committed to soaking you eventually, working with the patience of something that has nowhere to be. Half the remaining crowd made their decision and left. A family of 4, pragmatic and sensible, opened 2 umbrellas and turned in the direction of the gift shop. A couple made a run for it, laughing in the way people laugh when they're pretending to find an inconvenience fun. An older man with a camera, the serious kind, the kind on a strap, and everything packed into a case with the deliberate care of someone who had paid for that camera and was not going to apologize for prioritizing it. Maybe 15 of us stayed. None of us spoke about it. We didn't look at each other or make the kind of polite British eye contact that says, yes, we're all making the same absurd choice. We are collectively refusing to be sensible. We just stayed, spread out slightly, found small pieces of ground that felt like they were ours. I was watching him. The rain hit his bare skin and ran off the front of it in a thin stream. The scarlet tunic darkened slightly at the shoulders. His face, what you could see of it beneath the cap, didn't change. Not a flinch. Not the small, unconscious squint most people make when rain starts to fall on them. Nothing that you could point to and say there he felt that. Nothing. Or no, not nothing. Something I can only describe as a deepening. Like whatever internal state he was already holding, he simply went further into it. The way a tree goes further into the ground when the wind picks up. Not resisting, just rooting. The woman next to me, the one who would later call him remarkable, turned and said half to me, half to the rain. It doesn't even blink differently. I didn't have anything to add to that. She was right. By noon, the rain had made a decision. The light drizzle my weather app had promised with such cheerful confidence had evolved into something with genuine ambition. Not quite a downpour, not a storm yet, but rain that had stopped apologizing for itself. Rain that was no longer interested in being described as light. The kind that finds the gaps in your collar and the back of your neck and introduces itself there. Puddles were forming on the flagstones. The surface of the puddles was chaos, stippled and alive, and constantly being rewritten by every new drop hitting the ones that came before. I watched a pigeon walk through one without apparent concern, which felt like either optimism or complete philosophical indifference to circumstance, and I wasn't sure which one I admired more. There were 8 of us left. We had, without planning to, redistributed ourselves into a rough semicircle facing the sentry box. Umbrellas up, shoulders hunched against the wet, but facing him, all of us facing him, in a way you face a fire you didn't build but are grateful for. He stood. I want to describe what that posture looked like by noon, 1 full hour into the rain, because I think it's the detail most people miss when they talk about the guards. They talk about the stillness as if it's a trick, as if it's meditation or hypnosis or something performed. And maybe for some guards in some moments it is, but what I was watching didn't feel like performance. It felt like architecture. His spine was a structural element, not in a rigid, military brochure way, not the caricature of a soldier standing at attention that you see in films. More precise than that, more technical. Each part of his body doing its exact required function and trusting all the other parts to do theirs. No compensation, no overwork. The posture of someone who had stopped having a relationship with comfort because comfort had stopped being a relevant category. At 12:17, one of the tourists near me, a man in his 50s, German accent, very sensible waterproof jacket, said almost reverently, "How long has he been standing?" Nobody knew for certain. "At least since 10, I said. The man looked at me, then back at Dane. 2 hours, he said. In this, he said the way you say something that has stopped making ordinary sense. At 12:40, the wind found a new gear. It came from the west, from the direction of the park, and it didn't gust so much as arrive, solid, purposeful, the kind of wind that makes you feel the weight of air as an actual material thing. The flag above the palace was no longer arguing. It was being argued at, forced horizontal, snapping with a sound like a very sharp consonant repeated over and over. The rain changed pitch. It went from a soft, consistent percussion to something more urgent, more staccato. The puddles stopped being still between drops. They had no stillness left to give. 3 more people left. 5 of us remained. I don't know what we were waiting for. I don't know if we were waiting for anything. It was possible we had simply been there long enough that leaving felt like an interruption to something we didn't fully understand yet. He stood. The water was running off him in small tributaries now. The bearskin cap, those enormous things, ridiculously impractical, designed for a different century's sense of ceremony, had gone very dark. His boots, polished presumably to a mirror that morning, were now standing in a shallow puddle of their own making. The water around them was the color of the sky. Someone opened an extra umbrella and held it toward him, not over him. That would require crossing whatever invisible boundary surrounded the sentry box, but, angled in his direction, offered like a question. He didn't look at it. He did not look at it either. His gaze maintained its exact forward angle, but there was something in the quality of his attention, some peripheral acknowledgement, that told you he knew. He knew the umbrella was there. He knew why it was there. He stood anyway. The person with the umbrella held it there for a full minute, maybe longer, getting rained on themselves in the process, and then slowly brought it back over their own head. Nobody said anything. What was there to say? By 1 o'clock, the storm had officially become a storm. Not the catastrophic kind. Not the kind that makes headlines or floods basements or gets named. But a serious, committed London in October storm that was no longer pretending to be anything smaller than itself. Thunder, when it came, was distant and low. not crashing, more like something large shifting its weight in another room of a very large house. The lightning was somewhere out over the Thames. The four people still there with me had all gone quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of boredom or cold. The quiet of attention, of watching something that you don't have a category for, something that keeps exceeding the frame you try to fit it into every few minutes. I had been standing for 2.5 hours. My feet hurt. I shifted weight from one foot to the other, something I'd done maybe 40 times in the last hour without thinking about it. Just the automatic maintenance of a body that was asking for relief and being partially accommodated. I did it again, and then, for the first time, became conscious of the gesture. Became conscious of it in relation to him. He had not shifted. Not once. Not to my observation, and I've been watching closely enough that I would have caught it. That micro shift, the subtle transfer of weight, the thing every human body does when it's been vertical long enough. The thing every body needs. He had not done it. He was standing in a storm on the spot where he'd been standing when the morning was still gray and quiet, and the small dog was still unhappily tolerating the walk, and he was standing the same way he'd been standing then. Not worse. Not compensating. The same. I looked down at my own feet, at the small, unconscious shuffle I'd just done. Then, back at him. The woman to my left, she'd been there almost as long as me, patient and quiet, her umbrella tilted against the wind at a very specific angle, turned and said, "Do you think he knows we're still here?" I thought about it. "I think he knows everything," I said. She considered that. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." Somewhere around 2 o'clock, I did something embarrassing. I cried a little. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that requires acknowledgement or explanation or a tissue handed to you by a stranger. The small kind. The kind where your throat does something tighter than usual and your eyes decide to participate before you've given them permission. The kind you can look away from and pretend was the wind. It was the wind, mostly, but not entirely. I've been standing there for 3 hours by then. My cheese sandwich, third Thursday, as predicted, surrendered to inevitability, was long gone. My feet had graduated from uncomfortable to a specific, dull kind of suffering that I'd stopped actively monitoring, because monitoring it made it worse. The rain was in my socks in a way that I'd stopped expecting to unrain itself anytime soon. And he was still standing. Same position. Same exact architecture of posture. The storm had found its full register by then. Steady, serious, rhythmic, the kind of sustained bad weather that stops being dramatic and becomes simply the new reality of the world. The sky was the color of wet concrete. The flagstones were sheeted with a thin, moving layer of water that caught the gray light and scattered it sideways. There were 3 of us left by 2 o'clock. Me, the woman, and a young man. Couldn't have been more than 22, 23, backpack large enough to suggest he'd packed for every possible version of this trip, who hadn't said a word since I'd noticed him. He was standing completely still, which was interesting. Consciously or not, his body had gone quieter than it was when I'd first clocked him. Like proximity to Dane was doing something. Like stillness was a thing you could catch. None of us discussed staying. Staying had stopped being a decision. At 2:17, something happened. It wasn't dramatic. That needs saying up front, because everything else about this story has been building in the direction of the dramatic, and what I'm about to describe is objectively a small thing. A contained thing. Something that a security camera somewhere probably recorded and that some analyst reviewing the footage would mark with a timestamp and nothing else. A man tried to touch his rifle. Drunk. Visibly, pointedly, mid-afternoon on a Thursday drunk. He'd come from the direction of the mall, listing slightly, wearing a football shirt that was doing its best against the rain, a can in one hand, and the particular expression of someone who had arrived at an idea they found very funny and were about to share with the world whether the world had asked or not. He said something. I couldn't hear it clearly over the rain. Something about the hat, I think. Something performative, pitched toward his friend. Another man, standing a few feet back, less drunk, more uncertain, the expression of someone who had definitely told his friend this was a bad idea and was now being proven correct. He got close to the sentry box. Too close. The kind of close that registers in the body before it registers in the brain. The slight tightening, the instinctive calculation of distance and intent, that thing animal and old in all of us that fires before language does. I felt it. The woman beside me felt it. I know she felt it because I heard her breath change. The young man with the backpack went very still. The drunk man reached. Not far. Not all the way. It was the reach of someone testing, of someone whose courage was alcohol proportional and currently running at maybe 60% of what the idea required. He reached, and Dane moved. The word moved is wrong. Actually, it's too big, too sudden for what happened. What happened was more like a reorientation, a shift so precise and controlled that it took a full second for my brain to process that something had changed, and by the time it had processed the change, Dane was already looking directly at the man. Not turning, not startling, just arriving at a different orientation. His eyes found the man's eyes, and whatever was in that gaze, I was maybe 12 feet away, soaked through, paying very close attention. Whatever was in it was not anger, was not threat, was not the combat-ready hostility that you see on screens when they dramatize these moments. It was something older than anger, something that had been sitting inside a very long, very serious silence for 4+ hours in a storm, and was now directing its entire accumulated weight at one drunk man who had gotten exactly close enough. The drunk man stopped. His hand dropped. He said something, quieter this time, directed at his own feet rather than the crowd, and his friend appeared at his elbow, and they went. Not running. No scene. Just a quiet, decisive, slightly expedited departure in the direction they'd come from. Dane's eyes returned to forward. Exact angle. Same position. As if nothing had interrupted anything. As if the interruption had been absorbed and processed and released in the span of 3 seconds. No residue. The surface of the water returning to its pattern after the stone. The woman beside me exhaled. "Good Lord," she said softly. I didn't say anything. What she'd said covered it. 3 o'clock arrived with a change in the rain. It didn't stop. It wouldn't stop for another hour at least. I made my peace with that. But the character of it shifted. The sustained, serious intensity tapered to something more irregular. Gusts with dry moments threaded between them. The kind of rain that's thinking about being done but isn't ready to commit. The thunder had moved further east, out over the estuary somewhere. The light changed, slightly. Barely, but enough that the gray of the sky had a different quality, less total, more layered. I noticed it because I've been looking up and around a lot by this point, doing the thing you do when you've been standing somewhere for a very long time. Cataloging small changes, reading the environment with the close attention that boredom and cold and sustained watching give you access to. Dane was still standing. He'd been standing for what was now, I did the calculation, somewhere between 4.5 hours. At minimum, I'd arrived at 10:30, and he was there then, and I didn't know when he'd started, only that the shift change that was supposed to happen at certain intervals had clearly not happened on the schedule I'd vaguely expected it to. I learned later, from a woman who had apparently done some reading at some point in the previous 2.5 hours, possibly on her phone, possibly from some stored reservoir of knowledge, that in certain circumstances, during adverse conditions, under specific operational situations, the schedule adjusts. I didn't fully understand the specifics. What I understood was he was still there. And I want to try to describe what 4+ hours of standing in a storm had done to his posture, because what it had done was the thing that keeps sticking in me when I tell this story. What it had done was nothing visible. No ekkamedasjen. No micro-collapse in the shoulders, the way shoulders go when they've been held in tension too long. No forward lean, which is what a spine does when the muscles maintaining its vertical have been working past the point where working is easy. The angle of his arms was the same. The position of his hands against the rifle was the same. The axis of his chin, the orientation of his gaze, the precise geometry of his feet, all of it the same. I'm not a physiologist. I can't tell you what that costs. I can tell you what it looked like. It looked like the storm was outside of him rather than happening to him. The young man with the backpack finally spoke at 3:15. He said it to nobody specifically. Just said it out loud, into the general air while watching Dane, the way you say something that has been trying to get out for a long time, and finally stops waiting for the right moment. He said, I don't think I could do what he's doing. It landed quietly, not as a challenge or an assessment, just an admission. Plainly, the way you state something true that has no argument attached to it. I thought about my own feet, the specific way they hurt, the 2-inch shuffle I'd been doing every 20 minutes, the way my weight kept looking for new geometry because the old geometry was making its grievances known. I thought about the 3 times I'd bent my knees slightly, discreetly, just to remind my joints that movement was still possible. I thought about the coffee I was building a very elaborate fantasy around, the dry socks that existed in my bag and were not currently on my feet. No, I said. Me neither, said the woman. The 3 of us stood there with that admission hanging between us, which was its own kind of honesty, tourists in borrowed discomfort, watching someone occupy a discomfort that wasn't borrowed, that wasn't temporary, that wasn't going to end with a warm coffee and a change of socks. The crowd started returning at 3:30. Not the full numbers, it was still October, still damp, still that particular Thursday. But people came back. Some of them were new, probably arriving from somewhere covered during the worst of it. Some of them I recognized, a couple with matching rain jackets who'd left around noon, now returned, drawn back to the same place the way you're sometimes drawn back to a scene you left before it was finished. They came back, and they saw him, and they went quiet. Every single one of them. Individually, at different moments, they'd come forward, join the loose half-circle, look up at Dane, and go quiet in a specific way. Not the performative quiet of a museum or a church. The organic quiet of encountering something that doesn't have a ready category. Something that sits outside the usual framework you apply to things you see when you're a tourist in an unfamiliar city. He didn't register any of it. I kept looking for it. Some flicker of acknowledgement, some involuntary response to the shift in crowd energy, to the growing and changing audience. I kept looking because I wanted to catch the human underneath the uniform, the moment where the weight of all that watching pressed through into some visible seam. I didn't catch it. Either it wasn't there, or it was buried in a place I wasn't equipped to see. At 4 o'clock, a child did something. She was maybe 4 years old. Red coat. A small, firm person with a specific and determined quality that 4-year-olds have when they've identified something they want to look at and are not interested in being redirected. Her father had a very solid grip on her hand, but she was angling toward the sentry box the way small children angle toward things, with her whole body, her center of gravity already committed to the direction she intended to go. She stopped about 6 feet away, looked up at Dane. Her face did something that a grown adult face doesn't do, because grown adult faces have learned to manage their responses into socially acceptable shapes. Her face just opened. Pure unmediated astonishment. The expression you have when you're 4 years old, and you're confronted with something that doesn't fit inside what you've understood the world to contain so far. She stood there for what felt like a long time. Then, she did something I don't have an explanation for. She waved. Very small. Very serious. The wave of a person who has decided to acknowledge something, not to perform the acknowledgement to anyone watching, but because she felt it was the right protocol. Dane's eyes moved. A fraction. A degree of arc that I almost didn't catch. His gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward her. Then back to forward. The child's father scooped her up. She went without protest, still looking back over his shoulder at Dane with that same face, that same open astonishment as they moved away. I don't know if he really looked at her. I think he did. By 4:30 the rain was done. Not gradually. Not with any kind of ceremonial tapering. Done. The clouds broke apart in the way they sometimes do after a serious storm. Suddenly, with an almost theatrical change of scene quality, as if the weather department had received a note that the act was over and was responding accordingly. The late afternoon light came through gold and flat and specific, the way October light in London gets when it finally appears, apologetic low, making everything it touches look like the last frame of a film. The flagstones steamed slightly. The trees dripped. The world had that post-storm texture, washed, temporary, the feeling of having come through something into something else. Danestud. wet through, surely. His uniform had absorbed what 4+ hours of October rain delivers. His boots were in water that had already found its way into every seam. The bearskin sat heavy on his head, holding what the rain had poured into it. He stood like he had at 10:30 in the morning. Identical, as if the storm had moved through him rather than onto him. As if his posture was a material that weather moved around rather than into. I stood there in a new gold light and watched him and tried to find the word for what I was looking at. The woman beside me found it first. "Remarkable," she said, quietly, mostly to herself. But I heard he was relieved at 4:51. I know the exact time because by that point I had, without planning to, been holding my phone like a talisman. Not using it, just holding it the way you hold something when your hands need to be doing something and the rest of you needs to be still. I saw the relief party come around from the direction of the guardhouse, and I looked at my phone, and it said 4:51, and I felt something tighten in my chest that I didn't immediately have a name for. The ceremony of it, the exchange, the pacing, the very specific choreography of a post-relief guard transition is not particularly long. It happens at its own serious pace, observing its own serious protocols, and it has the quality of something that has been done so many times, in so many different weathers, in so many different centuries of roughly continuous practice, that the actions themselves have become load-bearing. The repetition is the point. The repetition is what makes it real. I watched it. The woman beside me watched it. The young man with the backpack watched it. There were maybe 30, 40 people in the loose crowd by now, the post-storm returnees and the late afternoon visitors, and most of them were watching with the distracted quality of tourists ticking something off a list. But the three of us watched it differently. We had standing in this cold, with this wet, with this specific accumulated understanding of what those hours had contained. We watched like witnesses. He walked away from the box, which is, I don't know why this sentence is the one that keeps stopping me. He walked away. It's not dramatic. It's not unexpected. That's what happens at the end of a shift. You leave your post, and you walk somewhere else. The most ordinary thing. But he walked with a specific quality that I noticed immediately and couldn't unnotice. Long, even strides. Military and practiced and purposeful. Moving with the efficiency of someone who has a direction and is going there. Nothing tentative, nothing like a man emerging from 6 hours in a storm might be expected to move. Nothing like a man whose body had just negotiated what that body had just negotiated. He didn't roll his shoulders the way you do when you've been holding something for too long. He didn't roll his neck. Didn't flex his hands. Didn't do the slow, grateful opening and closing of a jaw that's been set hard. He just walked. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to. The thing I think about when I'm trying to explain what this story is actually about underneath the weather and the uniform and the drunk man and the child in the red coat. He didn't sit down. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. After the relief ceremony, most of the crowd dispersed. The new sentry was in position. The moment was over. The narrative, as far as the casual observer was concerned, had reached its natural endpoint. People drifted away in the way that crowds do, unthreading back into the city, returning to their itineraries and their plans and the other places they were supposed to be. The woman beside me turned to me and said, "I'm going to remember that." "Yes," I said. We looked at each other in the specific way of strangers who have shared something and have no infrastructure for what that means. No shared contact information, no reason to see each other again, just the moment and then the end of the moment. She smiled slightly and pulled her collar up and walked back in the direction of St. James's Park. The young man with the backpack looked at me, nodded once, a nod that contained things, a summary nod, and went in the other direction. I stayed a few more minutes. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe I was just waiting to feel like I was done. I walked toward the mall, slowly, and that's when I saw him again. He hadn't gotten far. There was a small gathering area just past the section of fence near the guardhouse. Not public or not exactly public. More of an in-between space, the kind of institutional margin that exists at the edges of formal things. Other personnel nearby. Equipment being dealt with. The unglamorous administrative texture of somewhere that usually only shows its ceremonial face. He was standing, still standing. nodded attention. There was a looseness in his posture that hadn't been there before, a relaxing of the precise angle, a permission granted to his spine to be slightly less architectural. His hands were at his sides, but not rigidly. He'd removed the bearskin and was holding it. His hair was pressed flat from it, damp and dark. He was talking to someone. Another soldier, something being communicated between them in the quiet, economical way that people communicate when they share a common frame of reference that renders most words redundant. And he was standing. I watched him for maybe 2 minutes from a distance, far enough that I wasn't intruding, far enough that I was just another person in the post-storm light, nobody he'd notice or need to account for. He didn't sit. There was a step, a low stone step along the fence line, the kind of thing that functions as incidental seating when needed. The other soldier sat on it, briefly, checking something on a phone. Dane stood beside him, stayed standing through whatever the exchange was, through the end of the exchange, still standing when I finally turned away. I thought about it on the tube home. The Northern Line was damp in the specific way it gets when a lot of wet-jacketed people have been traveling in it, and the windows were fogged, and I was standing because the seats were full, and my body was making increasingly direct arguments about the day I'd asked it to have, and I thought about him, about standing, about what 6 hours of it does. Not to the muscles, specifically, though I'd become fairly informed on that topic through personal experience over the course of the afternoon. Not to the joints, or the back, or the feet. To the instruction, to the self. I kept thinking about the moment he walked away from the box, and the quality of that walk, and the continuing quality of his standing afterward, and I kept trying to understand what I was actually observing. Was it training so deep it had replaced instinct? Was it something chosen, in each continued moment, some ongoing decision so habitual it had become structural? Was it, and this is the thought that kept circling back, was it that sitting had simply become, for that part of the afternoon, an option that the body no longer had the appropriate context for? Like a language you can temporarily no longer access. Not forgotten, just out of reach. 6 hours of standing in a storm, and afterward the body holds onto the standing. Not because the storm is still happening, because the standing is still happening somewhere in the nervous system that hasn't gotten the update yet. The instruction still running. The posture is still load-bearing against a weight that is already lifted. I thought about all the things we hold past their end. The grief still functioning after the loss has become old enough to be called the past. The vigilance still running after the threat is gone. The guardedness that operates in sunlight because it was built for something darker and hasn't been shown that it's allowed to stand down. The body that forgets how to sit because it spent too long learning not to. I went home that night, and my partner asked how my day was, and I said, "Fine, it rained. I ended up at Buckingham Palace for a while." And she said, "That sounds cold." And I said it was. And I made tea. But later, lying in bed, I thought about his face. What you could see of it beneath the bearskin. The eyes that had registered the drunk man with their specific, accumulated authority. The gaze that had shifted, fractionally, toward a 4-year-old in a red coat who raised her hand in seriousness. I tried to imagine the inside of those 6 hours. Not the physical mechanics. I'd spent enough time thinking about those. The internal part, the thing that happens in the mind, and the self when the body is committed to a posture that doesn't shift, and the world sends rain and wind and drunks and children and curious strangers and thunder out over the Thames at it. I couldn't fully imagine it, which is its own kind of information. There are things that can only be known from the inside of them, from the position of actually being the still point around which everything else is moving, from the actual experience of commitment so complete that it stops being effort and becomes simply what is true about you for this particular stretch of time. I watched it for 6 hours, and I still didn't know what it was. I knew what it looked like. I knew the shape of it against the storm and the flagstones and the gold October light. I knew the peripheral details, the pins of my own accumulated discomfort, the shuffles, the wet socks, the small surrenders I kept making to my body's requests while 30 feet away something refused all requests. But the inside of it, the inside remained opaque. Status. I've told this story a few times since it happened. At a dinner once, someone asked about the London trip, and I started telling it, and the table went quiet in the way I didn't expect, in the way you don't expect when you start telling something you've been carrying and realize other people are carrying their own version of it. The version about the thing that stood still when everything else moved. The thing that held its post. The thing that kept its instruction running past the point where most instructions give out. Somebody at that dinner said, "What do you think it means?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe just that it's possible. Maybe that's enough." Someone else said, "Possible to do what?" I said, "To stand in the storm. To hold the thing you said you'd hold. To not go anywhere, even when going somewhere would be very easy and very cold, and the cheese sandwich is long gone, and nobody would blame you for taking the step that would end the discomfort. Maybe just that it's possible to be the kind of thing that weathers what comes at it without adjusting the posture." The table was quiet for a moment. Then someone changed the subject because that's what people do. But one person across the table, someone I didn't know very well, someone who'd been quiet most of the evening, caught my eye after the subject changed and gave me a small nod. The kind that contains things. The summary kind. I looked up the household cavalry afterward. Read what there was to read about the training, the protocol, the history. The way the whole system has been refined across centuries of practice into something that looks on the outside like ceremony, but is on the inside something more fundamental than ceremony. A demonstration of a principle. The principle that there are things worth standing for, and that standing for them means standing for them all the way with everything the posture requires, even when the cost of it accumulates and is something a dry set of facts can't fully capture. I read about the physical training required, the graduated acclimatization to prolonged static posture in varied conditions, the discipline that starts as external instruction and becomes, over time, genuinely internal, no longer performed but inhabited. I read it and found it interesting and informative and completely insufficient, because what I'd watched wasn't the description of the training. It was the thing the training had made. And that thing, that 6-hour, rain-through, storm-held, drunk-deflecting, child-acknowledging, posture-maintaining thing, was not reducible to a regime or a protocol or a history. It was a person who, at 4:51 on a Thursday in October, walked away from his post in the particular way of someone who carries the post with them when they go, who stood in the margin of the day's machinery, still standing, because some instructions take longer to release than others, who forgot how to sit, not from injury, not from damage, from the opposite of damage, from having been, for 6 full hours in a storm that didn't ask permission and didn't apologize precisely and completely what he'd said he'd be. That's all. There's no grand conclusion. No message I'm packaging for you at the end of this. No lesson, not really, except the one you've already assembled yourself if you've been paying attention. I stood in the rain for 3 hours and watched something I didn't have a word for. I still don't have the exact word, but I'm standing a little differently since then. Just slightly. Just enough that I notice it sometimes when I catch my own reflection in a window on the tube, on a Thursday, when the sky is doing that London thing of not quite threatening and not quite safe. I catch my posture, and I think about what it would mean to hold it. The storm that passed through central London on October 17th was later recorded as one of the heavier sustained rainfall events of that autumn. Wind speeds reached 47 miles per hour at their peak. The temperature dropped to 9 degrees Celsius by mid-afternoon. The household cavalry maintained its post throughout, as it always has, as it will again.